Welcome to another episode in our series, Did You Know? We've already shed light on a number of the influences on the kaleidoscope of who we are as South Africans. And we will continue to do so by looking at the various people groups and even systems and our art. As you join us in this series, I really hope that you will at times be also saying, oh, I didn't know that like I did. Come along and enjoy as I ask you, did you know what big influence the German arrivals had on our heritage? Today, Heinz Kusel and I will be giving information about our German heritage. Heinz is a direct descendant of one of the Springbok Deutsche, or Springbok Germans. Welcome, Heinz, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jolene. And obviously, what is a Springbok Deutsche or a Springbok German? I think that's the first question everybody asks. I'll just briefly explain. It comes nowadays because of our dialect. Because a German will say Springbok Deutsche, but we say Springbok Deutsche. And it's because our forefathers all came from the Hamburg, northern Germany area. And again, a German will understand it well. We stolpen über den Spitzenstein.
But Heinz, I absolutely agree with you because that's the German I grew up with as well. But let's not skip some eras here, like someone who opens a book and reads the last page first. Let's start at the beginning, and then let's look at some early stories. But I first actually want to give some background. In South Africa, we generally accept that the Afrikaans speakers of today are descendants of either the Dutch or the French Huguenots. But Kohlenbrander, who wrote the Afkomst der Boeren, estimated that of the 1,595 founding fathers of this group, 841 were German men, compared to the 529 Dutch and only 86 French. And then of the 841 German founding fathers, only 95 were founding mothers. So no wonder we can trace a number of our surnames back to the German speakers. But now, today we see Germany as a strong, prosperous country. But when Jan van Riebeeck landed in the Cape in 1652, there was no official Germany, only smaller German states. And there were also no German colonies that could accommodate German speakers that needed refuge from the extreme poverty they lived in. Now you ask, extreme poverty? Hard to think of the Germany of today as being extremely poor. But why was there such poverty? There were wars, long wars, 30-year wars, 7-year wars all over. And wars are devastating. So large numbers of job seekers left their German-speaking communities. And these young men traveled through dangerous areas in search of jobs, despite the lack of roads, the lack of transport, and of course, no email, no WhatsApp. And they joined the VOC, Verenigd Oost-Indische Compagnie, which was the largest company in the world at the time. And these Dutch East India Company had their headquarters in the Dutch Republic, where there was general prosperity. Even the Princes of Orange were from German descent. So they joined as soldiers or sailors. So now when Jan van Riebeeck landed in the Cape in 1652, we know that there were 3 men from the German-speaking areas who were already part of the 93 people that set foot on land with him. Michael Glewe from Staalsrund, Paulus Petkoff from Danzig, and Wilhelm Müller from Frankfurt. So let me get my R's properly done here from the German to the English. But not only desperate job seekers joined the Dutch East India Company and landed in the Cape. Zacharias Wagner, or as he was known, Zacharias Wagner, who followed Jan van Riebeeck up as commander of the Cape of Good Hope in 1662, was the son of a German. And then 10 years later, in 1672, Isbrand Goske was also a commander at the Cape, and he was also a German. So Not all left because of poverty. Some were adventurers, wanderers, or fleeing from debt collectors. We'll get back to one of those adventures a little bit later. But these people did not leave en masse. They left in small groups of family or even two friends, and then wandered through that dangerous territory to reach Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam, the Dutch East India Company could not supply enough soldiers and sailors to serve in all their colonies. So they were just jobs aplenty. But these jobs were not magic wands to riches. The salaries were low, the work conditions were bad, and they had to sign 5-year contracts. And then there was the high mortality rate on board, as well as once they actually arrived in the colonies, especially those in Asia. In the latter part of the 18th century, the mortality rate between the Netherlands and the Cape was up to 7%. So the other side of this coin, the influx from the other European countries, was of course welcomed in the Netherlands. But the outflow of so many young men caused a serious demographic imbalance in Europe. When we look at the statistics, it is proof that joining the VOC was not a walk in the park. Only 1 of 3 men returned to Europe after their 5-year contracts. But back to the German speakers that arrived in the Cape in the 18th century. On a vessel that sailed, for instance, in 1727, the Amsterdam, 41% of the crew were from German-speaking areas. Now, this high percentage was probably also the outcome of the recruiting agencies, because as the colony at the Cape developed, recruiting agencies in Bremen and Hamburg were established already in 1698, using a brochure with the title Trost der Armen, comfort for the poor. But again, not only the poor came. During the 18th century, the harvest in Germany improved, and that improved human and animal nutrition. So the arrivals from German-speaking areas now look different. Baron von Imhoff stopped in Cape Town as commissioner in 1743, and he had a significant influence on the development of this young colony. But we all know about Bletterman, who was a landlord in Stellenbosch, and who built the well-known house, the Bletterman House in Stellenbosch, after his retirement in 1789, also a German. But several of the German employees of the Dutch East India Company at the Cape excelled as botanists. For instance, Paul Hermann, H.H. Oldenland, and Jan Hertog. And then there was also Johann Schreiner and G.F. Vrede, who studied the Khoi. And then Peter Kolbe wrote a book of his findings after he was sent to the Cape to study astronomy. And then when we get to maybe my favorite, O.F. Mencken, he wrote a few volumes that were published in the late 1700s, with which I quote, a complete and authentic geographical and topographical description of the famous and, in all things considered, remarkable African Cape of Good Hope. He was born in Berlin in 1710 as the son of a Prussian privy councillor and court physician, so he was quite well educated. And as a young man, he also served in the army of the King of Prussia. So he came to the Cape as a soldier, although, of course, his education was far above that of the common soldier. But we don't know the reason why he actually came here. Maybe he was just sort of enchanted by the glamour of the East or the foreign countries. But he arrived in the Cape in 1732, 1733, and there he met Captain Alleman, who very soon appointed him as a tutor, for which he actually was not very well qualified. But he left the Cape after about 7 or 8 years, quite unintentionally. And this is the story. He boarded the ship Hartenlust that was anchored in Table Bay to actually deliver some of his letters to be mailed in Holland for his family and friends in Germany. And then he was sort of obviously chatting to the people, whatever, didn't notice that the anchor was actually lifted and that the Hartenlust actually gradually started drifting away. So he actually left for Europe without actually intending to. And he actually never came back to the Cape. But while he was here, he gave an account of life at the Cape from the view of one who actually lived here. I love his, not love, but I mean, I actually enjoy his descriptions of the women of the Cape, including statements like, all women at the Cape have bad teeth, both in the city and in the country. And he says it was because of the large quantities of sugar candy that they take in their mouths when drinking tea or coffee. But he had quite a lot more to say. I want to read an extract from his text, actually. In general, there are more marriageable women at the Cape than bachelors. Hence, if at some time one finds 4, 5, or even more daughters in a house and only 1 or 2 sons, and one teases the daughters by saying that there are so many girls and so few men in the country, they immediately reply, ah, that's not trouble. The suitors come from the fatherland, and therefore no spinsters will be left over. And truly, one hardly ever meets an old maid. And then he continues, the country girls have few opportunities for a tete-a-tete with men, so that one seldom, very seldom, hears of a girl having gone too far and fallen. But in Cape Town, they are not so strict. They also have more opportunities of being seduced. Still, there was a case where a white girl in the country had given birth to a black child. And at the Salt River, at a wine shop adjoining the crossing on this river, a former proprietress had a quite well-educated German husband and yet gave birth to a black child. But she declared to her husband and everybody else that she had been frightened by unexpectedly meeting a very black slave. So I found them very interesting quite interesting when he starts talking about not only the daughters of the poorer farmers, but also of those we are talking about, the well-to-do class, walk barefoot from childhood without shoes and stockings. And when the country girls do get shoes and stockings on their feet, either to attend a wedding or as brides to appear with their bridegroom before the magistrate board, as soon as the honeymoon is over, the shoes are laid aside and not produced again until such time as they go to town or attend a wedding or church service. And then he also had something quite interesting to say about the language. He said the language the people spoke is just as far from being pure Dutch as that of the German farmers is from pure German, but that they are very fond of hearing High German spoken and still more of hearing it sung. So that's enough of Menzel. Another very important group was those Germans that became free burghers at the Cape. They could be seen as the actual true founding fathers. People like Heinrich Elberts from Osnabrück and Jacob Kluten from Cologne. Some of them stayed in Cape Town and some moved into the interior. So surnames like Herzog, Strauss, Liebenberg, Krüger, Badenhorst, and some not so easily recognized ones like Lawrence, Botha Conradi are still very much part of us. And then, of course, in those times, some surnames changed, like Schuster became Skuman, or Fischer that became Visser, or Schmidt that became Smith. But they're all very, very soon integrated into the community. And this is also the main reason why the German language almost disappeared, because the men married Afrikaans women and adopted their language. And of course, there's also the distance from and lack of communication with the fatherland. And there were no links, trade links with Germany either. But let's leave the early arrivals and look at what else happened to account for the German blood in our veins. There were two main groups that I would like to
Can I interrupt you just for one short moment there? Something interesting I picked up, and I will actually read it. And that is, it also emerges from a decree of the Dutch East India Company Commissioner, who ordered in 1657 that no foreigners, but only Dutch and Germans were allowed to be employed. In 1779, the Kaapse burghers and kolonisten submitted a petition to the Heren 17, that's the Lord 17 of the VOC in modern terms, so the board of directors, in which they asked, geen Engelse, geen Franse and ander foreign nating to give permission to settle in the Cape. So the Germans did not belong to the foreign nations. That's the interesting thing I picked up also.
That is extremely interesting. Yes. So those were all the early arrivals, right? But then, you know, between 1807 and 1857, there were more German speakers arriving in South Africa, and they influenced our culture big time. Those were mainly the missionaries. So we can all remember Genadendal and Elim mission stations, manned by people like Georg Schmidt and Halbeck. And so from this period, surnames like Kaiser, Schreiner, Leipold, which we all know, Allied, Kleinschmidt, Kreft, Grigorowski, Ratloff, Döner, and Kropf, these are all remnants from this period of the missionaries. And then this next group, and the last one I'm going to discuss before I give the mic to Heinz, were the Germans who came to British Kaffraria and had a significant influence. So much so that there is actually a monument in East London to commemorate them. Oops, I'm so glad it's not in what used to be Port Elizabeth, because I don't think I would be able to pronounce that right now. But this is their story. Large numbers of German settlers traveled to Buffalo City during that time. But what is perhaps less known is the fact that there were, in fact, 3 distinct and quite different groups who landed in or traveled to what was then known as British Kaffraria. Firstly, there was the German Crimean Legion. Now, again, a bit of background there. Britain declared war on Russia in 1854, and they needed German mercenaries to help them. So an army was put together, but by the time it had arrived in Britain, the war was already over. So they were sitting around and not really having much to do. So they were offered an opportunity of settling in South Africa. And I was surprised to see how many of them actually accepted. 2,500 of them accepted. But here now lies a little bit of a twist. Sir George Grey, the Cape Governor at the time, insisted that they had to come with their wives and children, which not many of them had. So there were literally mass wedding ceremonies of the legionaries in England before they left. And then also some married en route. The Reverend Opperman apparently claims to have married between 60 and 70 couples in one day. Well, understandably, there was some doubt whether the right hands were joined together, but the clergy then decided that the couples could sort themselves out on board ship. Some of these brides were from Germany, but they were mostly English girls. So these soldiers settled in Kaffraria. That was an area that had very little development. And the legionaries established villages. Unfortunately, in that case, the military and strategic considerations outweighed the economic ones. So these villages ended up in remote and waterless areas. And then also in 1857, the Lady Kennaway, a well-known convict ship, on the final voyage anchored in East London, carrying 231 immigrants from British Kaffraria, and of these, 153 were single women from Ireland. So again, some brides that the legionaries could get. But these soldiers did not make good settlers. The settlement of the area was not successful. Most of them left, and they were also used again as British soldiers in India a few years later. But their main contribution was basically that they established little towns like Stutterheim, Hamburg, Berlin, Frankfurt, and then also establishing German congregations and schools. So when the second group of colonists came in 1853, they came mostly from Pomerania, which was poor, and they were poor peasants, and they actually were not accustomed to running their own farms. So they did not have a good time here, because in these remote areas they realized that the soil, the farms that they were getting, had very poor quality. So it was actually impossible to survive by farming alone. But interestingly enough, these were the only Germans that remained in Kaffraria. Why? Because they simply lacked the resources to start over again in another area. But they remained poor and were generally despised by the more successful British settlers. And then 19 years later, the second group of colonists came, and they were brought to the Cape, but only a small portion of them actually ended up in the Eastern Cape. Those were the Philippi Germans who preferred to stay in and around Cape Town. They were highly educated, or rather more highly educated, and they were also experienced farmers, more experienced than the first group in any way. But they also left their farms and settled in the local towns. So the Kaffraria Germans disappeared as a distinct group. What were the challenges they encountered, and what were the possible causes of why they disappeared as a distinct group? There were basically two main reasons. One was the church story, the denominational problems, and the other one was the language. So there were two denominations, the German Baptist Church and then also the Lutheran Church. But the German Baptist seems to have had a fair amount of support even before the Germans settled, but very soon there were tensions between the Lutherans and the Baptists. So the Lutherans did have a supply of pastors, but not enough. The Baptists, of course, had it a lot easier because laymen could much more easily take over when there was a lack of clergy. On top of this, the settlers received support from the local English Baptist community. So this denominational split reduced the chances of a separate German community surviving for long. And then the language problem, because most of these people actually spoke a sort of a low German dialect. And they now had to make the choice whether they want to teach their children High German or whether they want to teach them English. By living in an English community, it was a lot easier to teach their children some English, or teach them to speak English, because that was also better, of course, for the market. And then you need schools to actually teach your children German. But because these Germans were so poor and could hardly afford to keep a school going, that didn't work. And then the final blow of these German schools that were established by the legionaries, that during the time of the world wars, they completely disappeared. You can understand why. In a predominantly English area, the Germans understandably avoided using German in public. And then, of course, the German schools were taken over by the state in 1910. But the final blow came with the implementation of the Group Areas Act during the apartheid era. So what happened during this time, during apartheid, was that every group was given its own separate piece of land, so as to reduce contact between those groups. Now, while the people from European descent had in general the past received far the best land and the most land, they did lose some areas to other groups. One such area was that part of the Eastern Cape, which later became the Ciskei. And this was where the first two groups of Germans had been settled earlier. So their land was expropriated by the government. And all remaining Germans had to move down into the main towns, and as a result, a separate German community in the Eastern Cape ceased to exist. Up to now, we've looked at the different arrivals of German speakers into South Africa, and most of them came here because either they wanted to or sometimes had to. But their destination was always South Africa. But not so was the case of the Springbok Deutsche. That community still exists today as a distinct German community. And this part, I'm leaving to the expert, Heinz Kusel, who also is in the process of writing a book on this topic. So Heinz, tell us about your ancestors, the Springbok Deutsche.
I will gladly do that, Jolene. I just want to quickly just add another small group in between very briefly. There were also the so-called cotton Germans that arrived just before the Springbok Deutsche. And they were, for similar reasons as you've mentioned all the time, were also lured to this part of the world because of poverty. And there was a German Jew called Jonas Berchtal, and he had made a big effort to get some to come, and they came to Durban and went a little bit inland from there, and they established a settlement there, which is still called today New Germany. So if you pass on the way from Hermansburg to Durban, you will see these signs. And these cotton Germans, they came there, and the idea was to produce cotton because they thought that it's a warm climate which cotton needs. But Jonas Berchtal made one big mistake, and that was that it's too humid for cotton. And it also flopped, but these were some Germans that settled there in the early 1850s as well. And some of them are still around as well. But then I'll get to my forefathers. And these are, I will first go into the detail of what caused them. There was a German pastor called Louis Harms in what's called now Lower Saxony, Niedersachsen in Germany, in a little town called Hermansburg. Most people will not have heard of this, except if you somehow by chance have heard of it. But it's on the map, it's sort of halfway between Hanover and Hamburg. You will find it somewhere around that area. But anyway, he had this urge to do mission work around the world. Interestingly enough, although he had this big vision, he himself never left Germany. He never even visited any of the mission stations. And I'm not just talking of South Africa, there were other mission stations as well. But anyway, Louis Harms, he had this vision. He's established a mission school together with his brother in Hermansburg. And then obviously they had to get the missionaries to wherever. So they even collected enough money from the various Lutheran congregations, and they bought a ship called the Kandatze in German. Where does that name come from? If you look in Acts, you will find a place where it's mentioned the eunuch in Ethiopia went to Ethiopia, and he was reading his Bible, and the queen of Ethiopia, or around that area, was called Kandake, apparently even in English. But it became Candace, the name Candace, the girl's name Candace, is basically, and the meaning of it is just purely pure and innocent. So if you are called Candace, that's the meaning of the Queen of Ethiopia. You are pure and innocent. Maybe a lot of people didn't know that. Okay, anyway, so in 1849, he established this mission, and then he had this vision to, the reason for Candace and Ethiopia was to go and do mission work among the heathen, as the Europeans saw them, in Africa, and specifically in Ethiopia, which was not called that during that time. All the documents always speak about Galilee, G-A-L-L-A land. And if you Google it, you find a little bit of information, but it's not clear exactly where it was, but somewhere roughly in the area, southeast Ethiopia, Somalia, around there was Galilee. So this ship was sent off in 1853, end of 1853, and it was sent to Galilee. At that time, there was no Suez Canal, so they had to go all the way around Africa, and we know what that history is. So they stopped also, obviously, for provisions in Cape Town. So they met some Germans there, and then they carried on to Durban. They met a handful of Germans there, these cotton Germans, which I just mentioned, and also a Berlin Missionary Society pastor called Pastor Posselt. They met there in New Germany, but they were still on their way, so they went further to Galilee. And they eventually anchored in Mombasa, which is still quite a way. It's today in Kenya, but it's not too far from Galilee. And they negotiated to come on land, and they actually noticed that most of the Galilean people were actually Muslims and not black Africans, so they're more Arabic. And the Imam said there, well, we've got a God, we believe in a God, we don't need your God, so go back home. But at that time, there was no WhatsApp or so it took a while to get the message. So they decided they'll go back to Durban. At least there are some people who are friendly. So they landed there and went on land, and they wrote a letter to Louis Harms back in Germany. What should they do? This letter took at least 3.5 months by ship to get there. And then the reply would take another 3.5 months at the minimum. So we're talking of 7 months plus to get an answer. So what do they do in the meantime? They met this Pastor Posselt, and they also met Mr. Behrens, who came there earlier. And interestingly enough, I think if I'm correct, Mr. Behrens, he worked at a bank in Pietermaritzburg, which was at that stage still fairly many Boers or voortrekkers had also settled there, although it was British territory already by 1853, 1854. But Mr. Behrens had married apparently the daughter of Piet Retief, also just an interesting one. But anyway, Mr. Behrens was quite well off, also managing in a bank, and he had a plot of land not too far away of where our previous president now lives, at Nkandla, as he put it, not very far away from there. So he said, well, we have a lot of heathen here across the Tugela River, so why not do mission work amongst these? And I'll use the word once, but purposely, because in historical terms, it was used then continuously, but these heathen were actually called Kafirs in all the documents. And that's not what I call them now. It's just, it was documented in such a way. And just by the way, that word goes back to the Muslims again. They saw the Africans, which were not Muslims. In Arabic, there's a word which closely resembles that, kafir, the non-believers. So non-believers were, in other words, the heathen were called by the K word. That's the origin. But let's carry on to, not in Kandla, but now on this farm just not far away from the Tugela River. So not in Zululand, it was now in the Natal British colony still, but not far away. So they settled there, and first thing, of course, they have to learn Zulu. They obviously had to learn even English, but they had to learn Zulu because you can't do mission work if you can't speak the language. And this again, many, also the Berlin missionaries were involved in the first translations or written Zulu and other black languages, because they first had to hear it, understand it, and then to the best of their knowledge, they used the alphabet, which we all know, to try and make these sounds like what we've just recently heard, that the new city is being named Berga. And if you try and pronounce it with your normal Western European vocabulary, we battle with it. But so that's what they had to do, hear it and try to the best of their knowledge with these letters of the alphabet to actually write the language, because there was no written language, it was only spoken. So the grammar and everything.
So they were the first guys who actually wrote Zulu.
I won't say they were the only ones, but they were very much involved. There's a lot of documentation on that as well. That they were actually involved in their written Zulu and Tswana and etc. But that came later. So getting back then, and to make a few little stories more personal, just 3-4 years later, I think it was a second or third trip from Germany, now not to Galaland anymore. Oh yes, by the way, after 7+ months, fortunately, Louis Harms approved that they stay in Zululand or do mission work in Zululand. But they had already bought the property without his approval, but he fortunately did approve without knowing they had already bought it. So yeah, so these, on every ship there were a couple of missionaries who were normally married, and there were also a few men, and the men had to come with to help build the houses, the church, whatever work there needed to be. And that's where it then also becomes more personal, as I said. Oh yes, one more thing before I get more personal. Of the first 16 that arrived that were on the trip to Galilee, half of them were missionaries, the other half were single men, and they did not receive a salary. They shared everything that they produced, earned, or whatever amongst each other, because also, if you look back in history, Louis Harms was quite strongly influenced by his contemporary of the time called Karl Marx. So he was therefore, you can say, the person who introduced communism, Marxism to South Africa.
Very interesting.
But I'll get to that later again, that it didn't work so well, but that was the idea, that they share everything and so on. And also the idea was different to most other settlers till that time that came to the southern part of Africa, was purely to do mission work, to help the people, to build up. And also in all the documents I read, they always talk about these poor heathens. But it wasn't poor in the sense that we generally see it, lack of finances and primitive and so on, because actually the Germans that arrived, the workers with the missionaries, were the poor ones, because they literally arrived with a, let's call it a large suitcase, like a kist or whatever, like girls have before they get married. That was a maximum size, and everything that they would ever need had to be packed in this, because this Candace, the Kandatsa ship, was very small. It was a sailing ship, of course. So when they arrived here, they had to get by with whatever they brought with, and that's it. So they were actually much poorer than the Zulus, who had cattle, they had goats, they were plowing the land, and so on. So in human terms, or what's the correct word, the Germans were the poorer ones compared to the Zulus, the missionaries. And there's one interesting thing that Louis Harms also mentioned, and I'll use the German words, but also translated in English. All were capitalized, written in capital words. For 3 G's, the motto was Glauben, faith, and then Gebet, prayer, and Geduld, patience. Those were the 3 big G's for these missionaries. And then the lowercase g was Geld, money. So that was the least important for them. The first 3, faith, prayer, and patience, was more important for them to carry over to these heathen. And that's why they say they were poor, because they did not have these big 3 G's, the faith, prayer, and patience. But they had cattle, so they were actually rich in human terms. Okay, so in 1858, again, after a 3.5-month travel from Hamburg, a man called Friedrich Jürgen Christoph Kusel arrived also on the 22nd of January in Durban. And just by the way, we all know Durban's harbor. At that stage, they actually arrived on the 21st, but they had to wait for high tide, because the entrance to the harbor was at low tide. Even a small sailing ship couldn't enter. At high tide, it was deep enough for a ship to enter. So only on the 22nd, they actually landed in Durban or disembarked. And then they traveled up to Hermansburg. And first thing there, they obviously also had to start learning Zulu. And by the way, they also had to learn English because it was a British colony. But then specifically, this Friedrich Jürgen Christoph Kusel is actually my great-grandfather. So they learned all these things, and in 1861, they wanted to go deeper into Zululand, much further north than Nkandla. And so at that stage, King Mpande, Shaka's third brother, it was Shaka, then it was Dingaan, who we all know of, and now it's Mpande. And then also, just to put it into context, when my great-grandfather arrived, it was exactly 20 years only after Piet Retief was assassinated. So also try and put it in that context of this was still very current. And one little bit, and unfortunately I'll have to read this because I can't remember exactly all the things, but all this which I'm talking about is all document in black and white. They are in Hermansburg, Natal, and in Hermansburg, Germany, and even in Unisa. There are these big volumes of so-called Missionsblätter, mission pages, which they had to document back to Germany. And yes, there are report backs and sometimes a bit of spiritual sermons and so, but the amount of fascinating history, and there's two problems. They are in German. So it's not, yeah, but to translate them or even read them, you have to be able to read the old German print, the so-called Fraktur. Yeah. And Heinz, the guy speaking to you, can read Fraktur. Why? And we'll get to that later. Remind me if I don't mention. But the interesting statistics I want to read of 1861 is that, therefore, since the Lord once led us here, we must also direct our main attention northwards to Zululand and the countries of the Amaswazi, Obombo, and Amatongo. Now, you all know Amaswazi, Eswatini, Obombo, Lebombo Mountains, and Amatonga. If you don't know where that is, that's it. That little enclave in northern KZN up to Mozambique. That's where the Amatonga lived. And so these three are not Zulus, but they border Zululand to the north. And they are the population of Zululand in 1861 is so large. There are 200,000 people in Zululand. Think about it a bit. In 1861, now Zulu speakers number between 8 and 10 million. And about just as many more are in these northern countries, the Amaswazi, Ubombo, and Amatonga, which makes the Zulu speakers, Nguni speakers, about 500,000. So it is a massive mission area. That's what they deducted. And to put it into context again, in the entire Cape Colony, there at that same period, 150,000 lived, 1861. Yeah. No, sorry, in the Cape, 260,000 in the Cape Colony. Okay. And 150,000 lived in the Natal Colony at that period. So just to put it into a bit of context, and this Amatonga obviously went nearly up to Delagoa Bay, which is now Maputo, and that's another, but it's a large area to do mission work to these 500,000 people, because every village consisted about 4 to 10 huts, 20 to 50 people, and they were spread all over. It was only the king, and the king, interestingly enough, had 1,000 huts, King Mpande. So interesting bit of statistics. I just thought I want to share that. And carrying on that same trend, now they had to get permission from Pande to actually do mission work or establish mission stations in Zululand, not adjacent to Zululand like Hermansburg was. And so they asked for permission, but before they asked for permission, they decided the mission, they would build a house for Mpande, a European style house, to get into these good books. And my great-grandfather was one of the builders, also documented. And they built this house, and Mpande was very impressed by this grand house. I mean, although he had 1,000 huts, but he had never had a fancy house like that, with a couple of rooms, windows, chimneys, doors, all of this. But he didn't want to live in it. He showed it off to all his visitors, but he didn't want to live it. So, but why not? Because it had corners in every room. There were 4 corners where the evil spirits could hide. It had windows that could open where the evil spirits could come in. And then it had even a chimney where the evil spirits could get in. So it was not a nice place to live in, although it looked very nice. So also just a little by the way story. But anyway, one of the important things that Louis Harms also insisted on, and I tell it to the German tourists very often, that he insisted when they left on the ship, he would speak to them in Hamburg, and he said, remember, firstly, you are Christian. Secondly, you are Lutheran. Thirdly, you are German. So never forget this when you're out there in dark, deep Africa. And so by implication, Catholics weren't Christian, German Catholics even. And also because of this, he had this policy, because later, my great-grandfather, they moved up north there, and they worked there, and he also was lonely. So Louis Harms would send over some young girls, good Christian girls, from wherever all the congregations were, would send them over. It could have been occasionally that somebody had known, or the two had known each other by chance before the men left, but in most cases it wasn't the case. So in my great-grandfather's case, we don't know whether they knew each other, but 3 years after he had arrived in Durban, his bride arrived at Durban Harbor as well. Not just his, a couple of other men's brides arrived. They met and saw each other at the harbor, and then they traveled with ox wagons to Hermansburg, which took a couple of days from there, which just by the way is near to Greytown as well, Hermansburg. And then a week later, they were all married at the same ceremony in the church. Whether they'd seen each other, and because they were devout Christians, they stayed married. So interesting. You didn't even think of getting divorced or something. There wasn't something like that. There was one story I heard where it wasn't my great-grandfather, but one of the others, his bride arrived, he was in his late 30s already, and she was like 18 or 19. but her father had passed away, so her mother came with to join her. And when they were still on the ship in Durban Harbor and they saw this old 30-something plus man, which she had to marry as a 19-year-old, she and her mother said, do you really want to marry that old guy? But they were together until death and they had 11 children. So, so this very often happened as well.
Age does not matter.
I've still got time. I've still got lots of stories, but I've still got time.
I think we are running out of time, so
must I start wrapping up?
Wrapping up, yeah.
Yeah. So just maybe I'll wrap up in the sense in 1861 when they went up north, the little enclave where they settled. Most South Africans have no idea. They've never heard of the area. When I say Paul Petersburg, then people say, oh, Petersburg, Polokwane. I say, no, in KZN, in the upper corner. When I then start explaining and say Pietretie Vryheid, many people haven't heard of those two either. But they say in between, look just on the north, south, west corner of Swaziland, just outside. Then you'll find Paul Petersburg. But Paul Petersburg is not even where they settled. They settled in a valley, which later, it's also a long story, but there was the first German settlement church established there called Lüneburg. Very German name. And then, of course, the Germans know Lüneburg. It's quite an old city, very beautiful city. I've been there once. And then when I show them Lüneburg, all there is a general dealer shop, the old-fashioned one, where you say, I want that behind the counter, and I want that, and then you pay for it, and then you go. And it's still operating there. And then, of course, a church and a school was established there. And there's lots of stories there, but I'll finish with this now. And that is the interesting part. When they first settled there, they'd gotten permission from Pande. The next minute, here come the boere. They say, nee man, wat maak julle Duitsers hier? This is Boere Republiek. I said, no, this is Zulu-speaking area. We got permission from Pande. They said, no, that's not how it works. We in charge here. Thinking back again, 1861, Pretoria, capital of the ZAR, was only established 1855, so it just happened. And apparently there was a handful of Boers living there in the area, and so on. But also the Swazis came along and said, oh, this is a Swazi country. So in all the documentation, they talk about, I had never heard the word in German or in English, vassals, V-A-S-S-E-L-S. And apparently, if you try and Google that, it means roughly something like the outcasts. So these were, let's call it Zulu speakers, outcasts from Swaziland, outcasts from Zululand. There was a little settlement of these around, and these poor guys were continuously attacked by the Swazis and the Zulus as well. And so it was a real no man's land. And initially, Lüneburg was in the ZAR, but it landed up right on the border with KZN. Pity we don't have more time, because I can mention a long, interesting thing about, I think very few people in South Africa, including Germans, know that St. Lucia was in the eyes of the Germans to buy it, to create a harbor there, because if they could have that between St. Lucia or De La Goa Bay, Maputo, Lorenzo Marx, they, together with the Boers, would have a buffer zone right across southern Africa to prevent the British from just
Thank you.
claiming the whole of Africa.
Exactly.
But that's another day. But it's a very interesting, which I only learned a couple of years back. I'd never heard that before. I've got
Okay.
lots of info on that. But
Yeah,
anyway, I think that
that'll be in
gives
your
a,
book. That'll be in your book, right? Yes. So we'll get that in your book.
we need to translate it. It's in German as well.
That's not too bad. That's not too bad. Heinz, thank you so much for this very, very interesting talk. And I hope that many of our people now understand that we have got a lot of German influence in our, lot of German blood in our veins. So thank you for being part of Did You Know?
I'll end up, sorry, that I always end up and have to get out another point. The reason why virtually the only area of all the settlements that you mentioned and I mentioned, that little enclave, and a little bit in the Transvaal as well, most descendants can still speak German, is because Louis Harms arranged that they get the brides from Germany, and later on, there were enough to go around, and they just intermarried within this German community. But it got so bad when the time I had to marry, it was close to incest because everybody is related to everybody. So I am one of those traitors, and there are a few others who married a boerenmeisie, and so I'm a traitor in that community because I don't, my children can't speak German.
Oops, oops, yeah, well, I've got the same thing on my side. But anyway, thank you once again, Heinz. This was wonderful having you on board.
My pleasure.